Hello! Today we're going to talk more about the past. We're going to practice more talking about the past. So let's review. If I'm talking about the past, I sick last week. So I want the verb be in here in past tense. So what is that? I was sick last week. Was. W A S. I was sick last week. He was sick last week. W. Oh, that's a terrible W. I have trouble writing this way. W A S. He was sick last week. She was sick last week. W A S. It was sick last week. For example, my cat. My cat was sick last week. Was. W A S. Was. It was sick last week. You sick last week. You was sick last week. Right? No! You were. You were sick last week. Were. So repeat that. Sometimes people have trouble with that word. Were. And it has that R sound. So I sound angry. And then with a W at the beginning. Were. 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 Repeat. Were. You were sick last week. Were. And that's W E R E. Were. They were sick last week. W E R E. Were. We were sick last week. W E R E. So this is past tense. I was sick last week. Your turn, repeat. I was sick last week. He was sick last week. He was sick last week. She was sick last week. She was sick last week. It was sick last week. It was sick last week. You were sick last week. You were sick last week. They were sick last week. They were sick last week. We were sick last week. We were sick last week. Good. So this is affirmative. Affirmative means yes. Yes, I was sick last week. That's affirmative. So I'm going to write affirmative up here. This is affirmative. Affirmative is A, F, F, I, R, M, A, T, I, V. My marker is having problems. Affirmative. Affirmative means yes. I can also say something that is negative. Negative means no. So if I want to turn these negative, how do I do it? Do you know? I was sick last week. I want to make it negative. Something goes here. I was not sick last week. So I just put not in there, just like present tense. If I'm speaking in present tense about now, I say, I am sick today, or I am not sick today. So in past tense, it's the same. I was sick last week. Change it to negative. I was not sick last week. So I'm going to put not in here. N-O-T. I was not sick last week. He was not sick last week. So these are all the same. She was not sick last week. It was not sick last week. You were not sick last week. They were not sick last week. We were not sick last week. So that's how I make it negative. So this is negative form. So I'm going to write negative up here. Negative. N-E-G-A-T-I-V-E. Negative. I was not sick last week. He was not sick last week. She was not sick last week. It was not sick last week. You were not sick last week. They were not sick last week. We were not sick last week. When we speak in the negative in English, we use contractions. It's very common. So I put these two words together. Was not, I can put them together. Wasn't. Wasn't. So if I write it, I want to move the N over here, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and then move the T. Wasn't. Wasn't. It sounds a lot like doesn't. Same sound. Doesn't is with a D. This is the same except there's a W, a W. Wasn't. 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 Same here. Wasn't. So I have I wasn't sick last week. Same here. He wasn't. So I move the N, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. Same here. I move the N, I erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. So now it is one word, wasn't. Move the N, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. Wasn't. So repeat this after me, because sometimes people have trouble with the pronunciation. I wasn't sick last week. Your turn. I wasn't sick last week. And the correct pronunciation is wasn't, wasn't. But when we speak in English, we speak very fast. Sometimes we don't pronounce that T. Wasn't, wasn't. Or it's a very little T. I wasn't sick last week. I wasn't, wasn't. So it's kind of like an wasn't, wasn't, or a very little T. So again, I'll say it and then you can repeat. I wasn't sick last week. I wasn't sick last week. He wasn't sick last week. He wasn't sick last week. She wasn't sick last week. She wasn't sick last week. It wasn't sick last week. It wasn't sick last week. All right, and also I can make a contraction with these two words. Were not. Were not, I can put them together. Weren't. 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 So it's kind of like two syllables. Weren't. 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 But we say it really fast. Weren't. Weren't. I put them together the same way. I move the N, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. Weren't. I move the N, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. Weren't. I move the N, erase the O, replace it with an apostrophe, and move the T. Weren't. All right. So practice that one. Weren't. Weren't. You weren't sick last week. You weren't sick last week. They weren't sick last week. They weren't sick last week. We weren't sick last week. We weren't sick last week. Okay, so let's practice all of these. So I'll say it and you repeat. I wasn't sick last week. I wasn't sick last week. He wasn't sick last week. He wasn't sick last week. She wasn't sick last week. She wasn't sick last week. It wasn't sick last week. It wasn't sick last week. You weren't sick last week. You weren't sick last week. They weren't sick last week. They weren't sick last week. We weren't sick last week. We weren't sick last week. Good. So notice that we say this word very fast. Weren't, weren't, weren't. So it's weren't, but we say it very fast. Weren't, weren't, weren't. So that's just good to practice. Were not, or weren't, weren't. So this is negative. So we have two forms. Affirmative, that means yes. I was sick last week. Negative means no. I wasn't sick last week. And then there is a third form, and that is if I want to ask a question, which is called interrogative. So interrogative means a question. Interrogative, I-N-T-E-R-R-O-G-A-T-I-V-E. Oh, man, that's a long word. Interrogative. Or you can just say question. This is how I make a question. Interrogative is the same as question. So maybe I want to ask a question. How do I turn these into questions? So for example, we usually ask a question with you. I'm talking to you and I ask a question about you. So you weren't sick last week. How do I make that a question? I change these around. So listen. Were you sick last week? Were you sick last week? So I take out the NT because that's negative. We're going to do interrogative, and I change the place of these words. So were goes first. Were you sick last week? And remember, the first letter is capital. So now I have a capital W for were, E-R-E. Were you. And now it's a little y, little o, little u. Were you sick last week? And now it's a question. Were you sick last week? So I can change all of these to questions. So I know I can erase the N apostrophe T because I am not making negative sentences. I am making them questions. And now you can see the difference. This is a question. Were you sick last week? So I just have to change the place of the words. So this one, I changed the place. I was sick last week. Question, was I sick last week? Capital W, because the first letter is always capital. A, S, and then I. And this word I is always capital in English, because English is crazy. And now it's a question. Was I sick last week? Same here. He was sick last week. To make it a question, was capital W, A, S. And then he, small h, small e. Was he sick last week? And now it's a question. She was sick last week. Was she sick last week? And now it's a question. It was sick last week. Was it sick last week? So notice these are all small letters now because the beginning, the first letter is capital. Were you sick last week? They were sick last week. Were they sick last week? Capital W, E-R-E. And now this is a small t, H-E-Y. Were they sick last week? And now it's a question. And we were we? Capital W, E, R, E. And then we. W, E. Small w, small e. And a question mark. So that's how we make questions with the verb be in the past tense. So I'll say it and then you can repeat. We can practice. Was I sick last week? Was I sick last week? Was he sick last week? Was he sick last week? Was she sick last week? Was she sick last week? Was it sick last week? Was it sick last week? Were you sick last week? Were you sick last week? Were they sick last week? Were they sick last week? Were we sick last week? Were we sick last week? So this is interrogative. This is how we ask a question. So we have affirmative, that means yes, I was sick last week. Negative, that means no, I wasn't sick last week. And interrogative or question, was I sick last week? So we're going to practice all three. Here's some practice. You at home yesterday. What goes here? Were. You were at home yesterday. W, E, R, E. You were at home yesterday. How do I make that negative? So, let's see. You were not, and I can put it together, weren't. Weren't. So that's were, and then N apostrophe T. You weren't at home yesterday. You weren't at home yesterday. How do I make this a question? So remember, we changed the words. You were you? That's how we make a question. So this goes first. Were you at home yesterday? Were you at home yesterday? So now it's a question. So we have affirmative, negative, and question. Repeat after me. You were at home yesterday. You were at home yesterday. You weren't at home yesterday. You weren't at home yesterday. Were you at home yesterday? Were you at home yesterday? So those are the three forms. I'm going to give you one more. for you to practice. My daughter sick last night. So I want you to get a pen or pencil and a paper and write this sentence. Write the correct verb here. It's was or maybe were. My daughter sick last night. And then I want you to write this sentence in negative. This is affirmative. Write a negative sentence. Change this sentence to a negative sentence. And then write it again and change it to a question. So you can pause the video and write your sentences and then see if you are correct. So pause right now. Pause. Here are the answers. Were you right? Were you right? My daughter was sick last night. Was. Because my daughter is one girl, one woman, she. She was sick last night. My daughter was sick last night. Negative. My daughter wasn't sick last night. And question. Was my daughter sick last night? So these change. Was my daughter sick last night? How did you do? Good? Okay, so repeat. My daughter was sick last night. My daughter wasn't sick last night. Was my daughter sick last night? So those are the three forms. So in your house, you can practice this. You can write a sentence in the past tense. Think of any example. My husband was home yesterday. And write a negative form and a question form. And that's how you can practice in your house. So you can practice this, and I'm going to give you another thing to practice. Here's some extra practice that you can do in your house if you have time. If you don't have time, no problem. Write 2 sentences about the past and use the verb be. So was or were. And one sentence is affirmative and one sentence is negative. So when we use the verb be, we often talk about place, about location. So I am at home, I am at school, I am at the store, I am at the library, I am in the bathroom. And then past tense, I was at home yesterday. He was at work last week. She was at the clinic last night. So we talk about places. So here are examples that I am giving you. 2 sentences about the past. So this one is affirmative. My cat was at the vet 2 days ago. It's true. My cat was at the vet 2 days ago. He was sick. So that's affirmative. And then negative. Number 2, my husband wasn't at work last week. That's true too. My husband wasn't at work last week. He was at home. So affirmative, negative. So in your house, you can write 2 sentences about the past, affirmative and negative. And then one question about the past. Here's my example. Were you at home yesterday? So that's just one. Number one question. Were you at home yesterday? So write a question. Think of a question. And you can just practice, write the sentences and the question in your house. If you want, you can send me your sentences and your question. You can send me an email or a text, or not. If you don't have time, no problem. Or you can just write it on a paper for your practice. And if you want to show me, you can take a picture with your phone and send me a picture of your sentences. Or you can just show me on Zoom. So here's some practice for you. So 2 sentences about the past, 1 affirmative and 1 negative, and 1 question about the past. All right, and then we're going to practice more on Monday. See you then. Bye.